In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the front lower control arm on this Ford F-150. Sometimes these bolts will be seized, so make sure you have hardware on hand if needed. Hopefully that's not the case for you though, but you'll see what I mean in the video. Also, you need an alignment after this procedure is done, so keep that in mind. If you need this or any other part, check us out at oneauto.com. Let's get started. To get started, let's remove the wheel. Right in the center, you'll see 6 21mm lug nuts. Unfortunately, it is common for these to swell up and rust underneath the chrome caps, so I'm going to use a 22mm socket. But if yours are still in good condition, use a 21mm socket and take all of them off. Now that you have all the lug nuts removed, remove the wheel. With the wheel removed, it will be easiest if we disconnect the tie rod end off of the knuckle. So right here, you'll see the nut that secures the stud onto the knuckle. Use a 21mm socket and remove this mounting nut. And with it removed, use a hammer, tap on the knuckle right here to break the tie rod stud free and allow it to pop up. There we go. Now I like to tie this out of my way with a bungee cord, or you can let it hang if you want, but if you tie it, it'll give you a lot more space to work around here without this coming back down and while getting in your way. On the back side of the knuckle, you have the vacuum hose for the four-wheel drive hub. Pop that off and set it aside. Now from the back side of the knuckle, we'll have to unbolt the caliper from the knuckle, the whole assembly with the bracket, so just these two 18mm bolts. However, before we do this, if you look right here, the brake hose attaches to the knuckle and the ABS sensor as well, both of which we will have to remove off of the knuckle. So let's just start with the ABS sensor, which has an 8mm bolt going through it. Sometimes this clip, especially if it's not an original sensor anymore, will get in the way, but take this out. Set that wire aside, save the bolt of course, and then with a 10mm socket remove the brake hose bolt. Remove this bracket off of the knuckle. This will give us enough slack to move the caliper aside. 18mm socket on both of these bolts. Don't confuse them with these, which hold the wheel bearing on. They are also the same size. Leave this one partially threaded in so you can take out the other one. Take this one out all the way, and then you can take this one out all the way. Support the caliper, get a bungee cord or some sort of a hook that'll hold the caliper for you, and you want to tie it up against the frame. Flip it over. I like to tie it right here on this axis hole for the frame with a nice strong bungee cord, and this way it's supported and you don't put any pressure on this brake hose. Now your rotor should be loose. If it's seized onto the hub, and of course you're reusing your rotor, you want to try to tap right in between the lug studs to break it free, not on the braking surface, either on the front or on the back. That will damage this and you have to replace it. Try not to hit the lug studs though when you do this. Also, there are 2 threaded holes that you can put some bolts through, and those will push it away from the hub. Having said that, mine is free, so I'm just going to pull it right off. As you can see, there's already anti-seize here, so someone's been in here before and has applied anti-seize, which is what we're going to want to do, but it looks like it does need some cleaning, so we'll take care of that. Because we have to do this anyway, I'm just going to wipe off the anti-seize now. That way it doesn't get all over as I handle this. I'm going to show you how to properly clean it later, but at least if the anti-seize is out of my way, it's not going to get everywhere and smear on everything. Okay, it doesn't have to be perfect. Yours might not even have any. Hopefully it's not rusted, but I'm going to leave it just like this for now. We'll come back to it later. Using some pliers, let's remove the axle nut cap. Now if pliers don't do it for you, a lot of times it's seized on here and stuck. Well, you could use a chisel or a little screwdriver and tap it right on the top there. That usually will break it free and make it pop off. In here, you'll see the axle nut. It's usually a small 13mm nut. This shouldn't be very tight at all. Take it off and set it aside safely. Because the inside of this wheel bearing is greased up for the four-wheel drive actuator, it is unlikely that this axle is seized in here, but it can happen. So what you want to do, push on the front side, pull on the back side if needed, make sure it slides through. If it slides easily like this, perfect, you're good to go. If not, you're going to want to put that nut back on flush with the end of the threads, take a rubber mallet, not a steel hammer, and tap it until it breaks free. Continue by removing the ABS sensor from the vehicle so we can pull the knuckle away with no restriction here. You definitely don't want to damage this. There are very thin wires inside, very delicate, and you don't want to have to replace it if you don't actually need to. Once I get to this point, I prefer to just unplug it and get it out of the way completely as opposed to leaving it hanging like this. And to do that, just follow it up. This right here is going to be the securing point for the ABS wire. Flip it over and unplug it. Follow the knuckle up and you'll see a 21mm nut that holds on the ball joint stud, the upper ball joint, to the knuckle. Let's remove this. Most likely you'll have to use a swivel here. Okay, once you get it off all the way, or most of the way, you want to leave it on just a few threads. I'm going to thread it back on by hand so that as we break this knuckle free, when it comes down, it doesn't just swing further than it needs to. And now tap the knuckle right here with a hammer till this ball joint pops off. It shouldn't take a whole lot. There we go. Press the control arm down, remove the mounting nut, let the control arm go up. It's not going to go very far up, but as much as the bushings are pulling it. And as the knuckle comes down and forward, you want to make sure the axle pushes through, just like this. Perfect. All right. At this point, you should be able to bend the axle down, lift it up and out of the hub here, and put it to the side. I like to put it right over the sway bar link so that it's out of my way. Now I like to tie the top of the knuckle here with a bungee cord to keep it right up against the spring, because as we take off the nut for the lower ball joint, you want the knuckle to be able to slide down, and to do that we have to hammer right here. You could also use a pickle fork right in between, but most likely a hammer will be a lot more efficient in this case because the pickle fork will just get jammed in here. Use a 24mm socket, take this nut off. Put it back a few threads, just like for the upper ball joint. We want this to stay on here after it breaks free. And now take a hammer, hammer the back side of the knuckle, and eventually it should break free. Now take your bungee cord off. Support the knuckle, take off the mounting nut. Let it down. And there it is. Now let's unbolt the strut from the control arm. You can see that there's a 30mm mounting nut on one side and a 27mm bolt on the other side. I'm going to hold the nut with my adjustable wrench. Most likely this is not going to want to spin too much. And then I'm going to use my 27 socket on the bolt side. There we go. I'm going to leave this bolt in so that this can still be attached in this area while we disconnect the lower part of this sway bar link. So let's do that next. And from underneath the control arm, here you see the rusty 18mm nut that holds on the bottom of the sway bar link. I cleaned up the threads a little bit. If you can't with a wire wheel of some sort, I have a little tiny wire wheel that goes in here. You can try this way. Hopefully yours isn't this rusty. Also, I'm just going to apply some heat to this right off the bat because I know it's going to be very seized on there, and heat will most likely help break it free. Once again, 18mm socket on this mounting nut. So once I heat it up, I'm just going to quickly put my socket on there while it's still hot and expanded and drive it out. Hopefully it comes out all the way. At this point, we can tap out the strut bolt. It's getting caught on the thread, so I'm just going to unthread it. There we go. And now we just have to swing the control arm down so that this can come out of here and the sway bar link can also detach. There we go. It's not going to go too far down because the bolts for the control arm that mounted to the frame are still tight, but at least we have some movement. We know everything is ready to go. Both control arm mounting points on the frame will have a bolt with a nut on the other side. The bolt head is going to be a 21mm with the nut being a 27. In this case, because I have the space, I'm going to put a socket over the mounting nut, just like this, hold the bolt side, and loosen this up. I'm not going to take the bolt out. I want it still secured in here so that when we're ready to remove the control arm, it's still secured in the other side is not the only thing holding it on. Take the mounting nut off and set it aside safely. Let's leave this bolt the way it is and move on to the other one. On this inner one, it's going to be almost impossible to fit a socket on here because the space between the sway bar bracket and the bolt is very, very minimal. So a wrench is the only thing you're gonna get on here to hold the nut. And because of this, also you'll notice the bolt is shorter. So keep in mind the shorter one goes in the rear. However, if you do not have a 27mm wrench, you can use a 1 1/16. That'll fit just fine. So having said that, I'm going to put my socket on the bolt side on this one and hold the nut side with a wrench. Be careful because as you loosen this, the control arm might swing down unless it's held on with anything else. Okay, so it looks like I have to take the nut off just with the wrench. I guess I don't even have space to get it out of here until the bolt goes that way. That's fine. The bolt, unfortunately, is somewhat seized inside the control arm, so we'll have to unseize that. So let's work on that next. What I'm going to try is putting a breaker bar with a 21mm socket on the bolt side. Just try to put some pressure on here. Maybe it'll break the bolt free. I also did spray it with rust penetrant. Next option is to create some vibrations. Hopefully with the mounting nut being off, it relieves some pressure and breaks free. At this point, we're gonna have to lower the sway bar so we can get better access to that bolt right from the back of it. There are 2 brackets, one on each side. Both of those are held on with 2 15mm mounting nuts. Let's take all 4 off. At this point, be careful when you lower this because it's not held on the passenger side sway bar link since it's off the control arm, so keep that in mind. Now you can pull this bracket up through the frame, and this gives us plenty of space to get to this bolt from behind. I'm going to use the air chisel, try to create some vibrations going that way, pushing it frontward, and hopefully break it free. Some more rust penetrant. Try to go in the center, avoid hitting the threads. Put the nut back on to hopefully prevent myself from hitting the threads. And now, after a long fight, the rear bolt is out. Hopefully yours isn't seized. If it is, well, heat, hammering, and impacting motions should get it out. Get the front one out. I do have it bungee corded at the front here, so I'm going to carefully remove this front bolt and bring it down, take it off the bungee cord, and there it is. There's your lower control arm. Now I've sprayed this area with some anti-seize. I also sprayed the inside of the control arm bushings here, the sleeves, and as I slide this in, I'm going to try and line it up right away. And while I'm holding it, trying to get this bolt through, at least one of them. There we go. I also put a bunch of anti-seize on the bolts themselves. There we go. Slide that through. Now it's at least partially secured in place. We can put the other bolt in. And actually, I think I put this one backwards. I did, so now that it's at least secured, I'm going to take it out, put it in the right way. Make sure you put them in the way the manufacturer had them, because they are that way for a reason. And there we go. All right. It's secured, well, somewhat. It can pivot, so let's put the mounting nuts on. Let's put on this mounting nut, get it started at least. Okay, leave it like that. You want the bolt to still be able to move around. The control arm is obviously not in its final position. Just wanted to get these somewhat secured on here. When it comes time to doing the rear, I'm actually going to leave the sway bar out until the end so that we can get better access here. Now, obviously you don't have to take it out, but if you did, then you might as well take advantage of that and not put it in until it's time. Okay, so I had to end up getting a new nut. That's fine. Make sure you get new hardware when necessary. Do not reuse hardware that is questionable or damaged. That's crucial because, well, you don't want something bad to happen as you're driving down the road. Having said that, I'm gonna tighten this up a little bit, bring it closer. So at this point, you have two options. For us to tighten this control arm properly, we have to bring it up to ride height. You can bring it up, put the shock in, or the strut, and then press it either with a floor jack, a pole jack if you're on a lift, or some sort of support upwards so that you can bring it up to ride height, or you can take the strut completely out, bring this up because this won't be in your way, and then once you get it torqued, you can pry this down a little, put the strut in, sway bar link, and off you go. I'm going to go with not unbolting the strut and just putting this control arm in and jacking it up. Press this in. I'm going to put the strut bolt through so it can stay secured and get this ready. There we go. At this point, I might as well at least start the nut on to make sure it doesn't fall out. So there we go. Don't tighten this yet. We will tighten this when the control arm's up. This is also a bushing and you don't want to put it in a weird bind. Basically doing this will prevent the bushings, not just the strut, but also the control arm bushings from wearing out prematurely. They are under a lot more stress when you torque them this way, and then the vehicle actually sits up here. They are constantly under severe load, especially as you go over bumps. So this is what that avoids. It saves the bushings and lengthens their lifespan. I have my pole jack under the control arm. Let's raise this up, put some pressure on it. Let's start with this one. The torque for this is 406 foot-pounds. I do not have a torque wrench that goes that high, and that being so high of a torque, I'm just going to use my air impact and bottom it out, tighten it until it almost stops spinning, basically. This air impact is definitely not going to tighten this more than 400 foot-pounds. So in this case, it really helps to know your tool. That's it right there. And now for the front and rear bolts, the torque is 258 foot-pounds. My torque wrench only goes up to 250, so that's where I'm going to torque it to. I'm just going to max out the torque wrench basically. 27mm socket on the nut side and 21 on the bolt side. I'm going to torque the nut side on both since I can. Torquing the nut side always gives you a better torque spec because you avoid the friction of the bolt going through this entire sleeve here. So basically you get a more accurate torque reading in the end. I'm going to start by snugging these up. Try to get the alignment as close as possible as it was before. Obviously you will still need an alignment after this, so you want to let the alignment professional do the rest, but if you can get it close, go ahead. Okay, that's one. And now the rear. As soon as I can, I'm going to torque the nut side here. Okay, that's it right there. Let's remove the support that we put here. So at this point, you may or may not have noticed that the sway bar link is still not in the control arm. And I did that because I have it unbolted. If you don't have the entire sway bar unbolted and you can't move it around, you would have wanted to put the sway bar link in already. However, if you can unbolt the sway bar, honestly, it does make things a lot easier from multiple points of view. At this point, I can just grab this, slide it through. Notice I put anti-seize on those threads so that hopefully when it comes time to replace this, the sway bar link is still perfectly fine, just a little rusty, but it's not going to last forever. So when you do need to replace it, if you put anti-seize on the threads now, you'll have a much easier time removing that nut at the bottom in the future. So now that this is in, let's secure it on the bottom and put the sway bar back up. I'm going to have to reuse my original mounting nut, even though it's a little rusty and the neoprene coating here has come off when I heated it up, but that's okay, it'll still work. Let's snug this up, 18mm socket, and torque it to 59 foot-pounds. 59 foot-pounds, here we go. Put this bracket back in. This is the passenger side that we were working on. I didn't remove the driver's side one. Bring the sway bar up, line it up with the bracket bolts. Once it goes through, have a nut ready, at least one, and start it on so that as soon as you thread this on, you can let go and this can't fall down more than this. Get the other one started as well, might as well at this point. And let's put the other side back on. This one should line up already since one side is already on. All right, let's tighten them up. Make sure they're even. I will come back and torque these, but let's bolt up the other side nice and snug first. And now this side should be pretty much pressed up against the frame because the other side is tight. All right, torque for these is 41 foot-pounds. That's 1, 2, 3, and that's all of them. Now take the knuckle, put it through the lower ball joint, move the stud if you have to. There we go. It's got to swoop in like that and put the nut on. This should hold it secure here temporarily. Now let's tighten this up and we'll might as well torque it at this point. 24mm socket. Make sure the knuckle's lined up. The torque for this is 111 foot-pounds. Keep in mind that as you try to torque this, the knuckle's going to spin, but eventually it'll bottom out and then you can torque it. Nope. Okay, looks like I got it pretty much close right off the bat, so that's perfect. This is torqued. Now before we put the axle into the knuckle, I'm going to reapply some grease, not just to this shaft here, but also to the splines. It's important that you clean off any old grease and re-grease it. I mean, if the old grease looks just fine, then leave it, but new grease is always good. You want the four-wheel drive actuator to engage properly, especially since you are able to engage four-wheel drive while driving, while this is spinning, and you want it to mesh onto these splines perfectly at regular driving speeds. Otherwise, you'll have some grinding and four-wheel drive issues overall. You don't need a lot of grease. There should already be grease in there. And at this point, let's bring the knuckle up, slide the axle through slowly. Make sure it actually comes through the front. If it doesn't line up, try spinning it. There we go. Just like that. Line up the upper ball joint with the knuckle here. Hold the knuckle in place until you get to put the mounting nut on. Push the upper control arm down. If you can't push it down enough, just use a pry bar in here. Pry it down. Looks like we've got just a few threads to stick out. That's perfect. So let's grab the 21mm socket here and tighten up this mounting nut. You'll need a swivel for this one. Torque for this is 85 foot-pounds. The knuckle's going to spin, but as soon as it bottoms out, there we go, that's 85. Put the vacuum hose back on the hub, push the axle through, make sure that the threads come out all the way. This is not all the way. You want the axle to get into the four-wheel drive hub seated. There we go, that's all the way. When you can't move it around left and right, that's how you know it's seated. The seal the seal back there is basically what positions it perfectly in place. So once it's pressed in and through, take the mounting nut. If you still have your original one, it'll be a 13 millimeter. For me, it's a 15 millimeter. And let's tighten it up. The torque for this is only 20 foot-pounds, so once you bottom it out, just leave it there and grab the torque wrench. You don't want to over-tighten it by accident. That's snug. Hold the hub from spinning. Because it's so low, you can just hold it by hand. And that's it right there. Don't be tempted to go even further than this because it can damage the wheel bearing if it has too much pressure on this. This basically squishes everything together here, and 20 foot-pounds is all that this wheel bearing needs. Next, take the little cap. I just put some silicone around it, and you can put grease if you want. Basically, the goal here is to seal this up completely. Take a rubber mallet, tap it in. Once it's bottomed out, you can wipe off the excess goo, and well, there you go, that's installed. This just protects the threads from rust and debris and all that, so just make sure it's nice and tight in there. When it comes to the hub, mine's pretty clean. It is a fairly new hub, it looks like, but I still see some pitting and rust buildup, so I'm going to take a wire wheel on a drill and kind of clean this up. I don't need to sand anything at this point. If you do, if it's rotted and has severe rust buildup, you might need some sanding discs on a little die grinder, but whatever you have, make sure that the surface is very flat and clean here. We will reapply anti-seize at the end, but if the rotor doesn't sit flat, the wheel doesn't sit flat, and you get weird braking issues and vibrations down the road. So you want to avoid that. So clean this up. Okay, the outer ring looks perfect here. The inner one, I'm going to try to get this wire wheel in there. It's important that you do these two ridges here, the center. I mean, if it's built up a lot, sure, sand it down, but it doesn't really matter because it's actually recessed into the hub. So the rotor only touches here and here, really. Let's grab some brake parts cleaner and clean this all up. With a collection bucket underneath, spray this down. And apply anti-seize to the entire surface of the hub. Try to avoid getting it on the lug studs though. There we go. If you have the brushed kind, that actually sometimes is better because it's a more controlled application. And at this point, if you are reusing your old rotor, make sure you clean up the inside of the rotor too. You can see those two rust ridges. That's exactly where the hub was riding and will. So sand these down, make sure they're nice and flat. I'm actually not reusing the old rotor. I have a new one. But regardless, the procedure is the same from here on, whether you're using old or new brakes. Now take your rotor and slide it over. I like to put a lug nut on so it can hold the rotor for me and it doesn't flop around. It'll not only make the caliper installation a lot easier, but if rust falls down in between here from it moving around, hitting the backing plate, well, now you have a rust chunk that's pushing the rotor off, tilted one side, and well, you just cleaned it up and made this flat surface. Worked really hard to do that, and now the rotor isn't sitting straight. So make sure you secure it. Now you want to take your caliper and slide it over the rotor. Grab the two bolts that hold this on, start them in. Sometimes you have to move this around a few times to actually get it to line up. Okay, there we have it. They're started. Let's tighten them up, make sure the ABS wire isn't getting pinched anywhere. This brake hose isn't looped around. You didn't accidentally spin the caliper. If you do, well, take it off, and definitely do not twist this around because it will restrict brake fluid flow. 18 millimeter socket. Whoops, wrong bolt. Yep, pay attention. 136 foot-pounds is the torque for both of these bolts. There's one and two. Resecure the brake hose as well as the ABS wire. We'll do this one first. This is the 10mm bolt. Thread it all the way in. Hopefully you can do this by hand. A lot of times these get rusty. If they do, clean them up, potentially replace them if necessary, and I recommend adding anti-seize to them so that it doesn't rust in the future. Get this one started as well, and let's snug them up. There we go. Be careful with these. You don't want to break them. They are small. Perfect. Let's resecure the ABS sensor on this bracket where the brake hose also is. It also gets resecured up here by the control arm. And finally, the main electrical connector. Make sure it clicks. Put it behind the fender liner and lock it in. Get the tie rod back into the knuckle. Put the mounting nut on. Tighten it up, and the torque is 85 foot-pounds. That's it right there. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 6 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and the torque for these in a cross pattern is 150 foot-pounds. Double check them if you want, and of course, don't forget to get yourself in alignment. So there you have it. I hope this video was helpful. If it was, don't forget to leave a like, and if you have anything to say, leave it in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you can stay up to date with all of our future content. Thanks for watching.